Hi, welcome to this video about Moonwalker by Metabolic Devices. In this video I will try to shed some light on the quite arcane feature set of Moonwalker, which could be described as an envelope generator, but I think that's really not doing it justice, because you can just as well use it as an LFO. In fact, there's two outputs with some phase relation. The same goes for the envelope, by the way. You can switch Moonwalker to oscillate at audio rates, and because there's a volt per octave input here and it tracks pitch really well, so you can really just use it as an oscillator. And you might think, hey, I don't like unipolar oscillators or LFOs. Don't worry, there's a switch here that lets you select unipolar or bipolar mode. But because this is not your standard envelope LFO VCO, the functionality of all these switches and knobs might not be straightforward when you first start using Moonwalker. And to give the video some kind of structure, I will, for the biggest part of it, just follow the manual, which is quite elaborate. Thank you very much to Eric, by the way, for sending me this unit so I can learn it and make a video about it. I hope to do Moonwalker justice in this video, because I think when you just first start working with it, there's quite a few things that could be misunderstood that are actually really powerful features of this module. So let's first listen to some sound and patch examples, and after that we'll take a deep dive into Moonwalker. So let's just start off exploring Moonwalker as it is described in the manual. So when you first fire up your system after installing Moonwalker, the module should be in one-shot mode, which means it's not looping or oscillating. You can activate that feature here. I've switched the unipolar bipolar setting to unipolar here, and I'm using the center position of the speed switch. You can manually trigger the envelope here, and as you probably would expect, you can adjust the settings of the envelope that Moonwalker is generating with these knobs. First one is the attack stage and the second is the decay stage. Now, instead of triggering this manually, you can send in a trigger. Let me route it through data. You can see this trigger or gate signal here. It's the yellow trace, and I'll connect the yellow cable to the trigger input, which is on the bottom here. I'm using this envelope to open and close a filter. I'm using a ripples filter for this demo. And as you can see, you can just use Moonwalker as a standard envelope generator. Sending modulation into these inputs here at the bottom modulates the length of the corresponding stages. Let's modulate the decay time. So I'm sending in a sine LFO, but as you can hear, nothing is happening, and this is because this attenuverter is nulled. So let's open it a little bit. And because this is an attenuverter, you can invert the effect of the incoming modulation as well. This input accepts plus to minus 5 volt signals. And yeah, of course, the effect will be dependent on how you set up this attenuverter. The attack stage has the same functionality. And the volt per octave input controls the length of both the stages at the same time, but with the added detail that higher voltages will actually shorten the attack and decay times. And this is so we can use it as an oscillator where a higher voltage creates a higher pitch with faster oscillations. Let's increase the decay time. And you can see that even though sometimes we have two gates close to each other, the envelope ignores every trigger that happens while it's running through its stages. You can change this behavior by engaging this button here, which is in this mode of operation the re-trigger button. And now we can see that the envelope coming from Moonwalker is re-triggered every time there is a gate signal. By the way, something that I haven't mentioned yet, we're actually monitoring two outputs of Moonwalker here. The left output is the reference output, which is sent to the left input on data, and it's the green trace. But let me turn it off for a moment. And The right output here at the top is the phase offset output. This one is going into the second channel of data, and it is the blue trace. For the moment, these two outputs generate the exact same signal, but I just wanted to mention it so you don't get confused. These two outputs become very interesting once you start offsetting the phase. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and just keep this at 0, which means the phase offset between the two outputs is 0. And by the way, if you're following along with this demo, keep in mind that this button is centered or nulled as well, because there's some normalization going on that I will get into later. There's this interesting switch here that inverts the attack and decay stages. And you can see that the decay time is actually now the attack time, and vice versa. And when you press this down for a moment and then let go of it, the attack and decay stages are reversed every other envelope. So in essence, it's just alternating the regular setting and the inverted setting. And then you can see, by combining a few of the features, you can get something that is far more interesting as a standard envelope that's always the same. Now let's check out Moonwalker as an LFO. For this, you simply need to engage the looping or cycling or repeat knob. And the function of the attack and decay knobs is just the same as it was in envelope mode, but now it's just cycling or looping. And for the moment, let's keep Moonwalker at the unipolar setting here. The control voltage inputs and the according attenuverters have the same functionality as before, as does the volt per octave input. Let me just quickly send in a short sequence. And you can see that by using the volt per octave input, the attack as well as the decay stage are influenced at the same time. Let's remove this. Now let's send a clock signal into data. You can see that steady clock here. It's a very short gate or trigger. And let's use that signal to send it into the trigger input here. And when you engage the re-trigger function, you can kind of sync Moonwalker to your tempo, even though it's not really running at the same BPM as the clock. And now this clock is rather fast, but if we slow it down. You can create interesting patterns where your LFO kind of syncopates to your beat, but gets synced every once in a while. This can be musically very pleasing. Let me quickly add a kick drum to this. You can also still reverse the attack and decay stages, or alternate between them. And I think even at this point you can already see that Moonwalker is really not your standard envelope or LFO module, and we're really just scratching the surface at this moment. So without the gate connected to Moonwalker here, let me increase the multiplier for the clock again. And to demonstrate you what this trigger or gate input functions like when you turn off the retrigger function, actually at this point this input becomes the inhibit input. And to demonstrate what that does, let me widen my gate and let's connect it back into Moonwalker. Now what this input does when this retrigger button is not engaged, it actually looks at how long the gate stays high, and depending on the settings of your attack and decay, when the gate input is high, Moonwalker will either just go to 0, go to 10 volts, or slow down the envelope drastically. And this can create really interesting patterns. But let's remove the gate and let's just add a steady voltage coming from mats. So now I'm sending in, maybe it's not apparent because there's no 0 line, but you can see now the yellow trace is at 0, and when I turn it up I'm sending 5 volts into the inhibit input. So now there's nothing going into the inhibit input. And you can see at the current setting of the attack and decay knobs, when sending 5 volts into the inhibit input, the envelope just goes to 0. When increasing the attack and decay setting, you can see that the LFO is just slowed down a lot. And it really depends on how these are set up, what this input does. You can see at this setting the output actually goes high whenever there's a gate signal present. And let's remove the steady voltage and connect some kind of random gate here. Let's make that gate a little bit wider. And this can give you really interesting, almost stepped voltages. Actually, let me use the clock again instead of a random gate. You can still invert the attack and decay stages, or use the alternating mode. And now to introduce the phase offset, let's rewire our patch. So right now you should be hearing something in your right ear. This is an oscillator still going through the same ripples filter, but it's only controlled by the blue trace, the blue cable. And this is the phase offset output of Moonwalker on the top right here. By the way, you can see from the LEDs what the envelopes or LFOs are doing, which you'll see at some point can be very useful. So there's one output of my oscillator that's been filtered by a ripples filter, being controlled by the signal that's represented as this blue line. And then there's another output of my VCO being filtered by another ripples filter. This one is panned to the left. And I'm using the reference output of Moonwalker, which is represented as green trace. I'm using that signal to modulate the filter, and we can hear the result of that in our left ear. So now both at the same time, and of course there's little difference except for the right signal being a filtered saw wave and the left signal being a filtered square wave. But let's now introduce some phase offset by turning this knob for phase offset, which is currently at 0, to the right. And this is a very cool, very unique feature of Moonwalker, which kind of blew me away the first time I tried this. At the center position of this knob, the phase offset is 180 degrees, by the way. And you can clearly see this because the two lines are inverted versions of each other. And when you turn it completely to the right, the phase offset is 360 degrees, which is kind of the same as 0 degrees. And as you might have guessed, you can modulate all of this with CV. Let's send in stepped random into this top input here, which controls the phase offset. And you can attenuvert the signal you're sending in, or the effect of the signal you're sending in, with this attenuverter. turn down the frequency of my oscillator, and let's use the not decay output to the left here. And this output is just sending out a 5-volt gate whenever the reference envelope or LFO or just reference output is not in the decay stage. So whenever it's in the attack stage or when it's idle, this output sends out a 5-volt gate. And let me connect this to the FM input on my oscillator. And let's add the kick drum again. So right now we're just controlling 2 filters with the outputs of Moonwalker. We are controlling the phase offset between the 2 outputs with a stepped random. And I'm kind of gating or inhibiting the oscillations of Moonwalker by sending in a white clock into the trigger or inhibit input here. And then of course we can still add to that by modulating, for example, the attack and decay stages. And if we re-engage the repeat or sync setting here, we can now see that instead of inhibiting the output of Moonwalker, the gate we're sending into the trigger or inhibit input is now just syncing the oscillations. Now let's have a somewhat closer look at what the phase offset stuff is all about on Moonwalker. So right now we're still in the medium speed setting. The envelope is cycling, looping or repeating, and we are still in the unipolar mode. Let's turn off the repeat knob so we can trigger the slopes manually. And by the way, in every mode of Moonwalker, whether it be LFO envelope or VCO function, pressing the play button here always has the same functionality as connecting a trigger or gate into the trigger, gate or inhibit input here. So right now we're listening to 2 sounds panned left and right. One is, well, actually it's 1 sound, but it's going through 2 filters. It's a PWM wave coming from even VCO that I've split into 2 with a stackable. It's going through 2 ripples filters, and the first output, the reference output of Moonwalker, is controlling the frequency of the filter that is panned to the left. And the right output, or the phase offset output, is controlling the frequency of the filter that is panned to the right on the mixer. So there's 2 modes of operation that primarily influence the signal coming from the phase offset output here, and that's the unipolar and the bipolar setting. Up until now I always had it in the unipolar setting. What the unipolar setting gives us, let me shorten the times here. Before I explain, let me turn the offset knob. So the blue trace is the phase offset output and the green trace is the reference output. So what the phase offset output or the blue trace on the scope does when it's in unipolar mode is it will always stay between 0 and 10 volts, but it will not always start or idle at 0. And this really depends on how you turn the phase offset knob here. But as you can see, and by the way, the reference output is always between 0 and 10 volts, but the phase offset output in the unipolar setting remains between 0 and 10 volts at all settings of the offset knob. Now this changes when you switch it to bipolar. When the phase offset is 0 degrees, they're still the same and the phase offset output is between 0 and 10 volts. And it starts at 0, but when you start turning the offset up, you can see that the blue trace still starts at 0, but is not reaching 10 volts anymore. In fact, it's dipping below 0 at 180 degrees of phase offset. It's exactly the opposite as the reference output. So at that point, it's between 0 and minus 10 volts. And then when I increase the phase offset further, you're back at 360 degrees phase offset, which kind of is the same thing as 0 degrees offset. So the big difference between the unipolar and the bipolar setting is that the phase offset output at unipolar settings will always oscillate between 0 and 10 volts, but it will not necessarily start at 0 volts. And in the bipolar setting, the phase offset output will start at 0 volts, but the voltage range between which the oscillations happen changes. At 0 degrees offset, it will oscillate between 0 and 10 volts, but at 180 degrees of offset, it will oscillate between 0 and minus 10 volts. And of course, with every setting of the knob, there's some kind of situation that's between those two. And to try to make a little bit more sense of this, I made this diagram or schematic. I don't know for sure how to call this. And on the top left, you can see kind of an example, a reference, oscillation or envelope. And you can see to the right of that in orange are the phase offset waveforms out. I've drawn the 0 axis, so you have kind of a reference where that is. And you shouldn't really think of the attack and decay settings on Moonwalker as being time settings. They're more slope settings. They kind of control the steepness of the slope. Then when you look at the situation below the first examples, I've introduced some phase shift, and this phase shift correlates to 180 degrees, and that's why I said to not try to look at the attack and decay settings as time settings, but more as slope settings. And at that point, the phase offset waveform out actually starts by decaying. And then when the decay slope has done its thing, we're rising again at the steepness that we set with the attack knob. You can see in the bipolar setting that our waveform is completely below 0 at this point. And then the example on the bottom I introduced another random phase shift, at which point you can see that we're getting a part of the attack slope, then we get the decay slope, and then we have the rest of the attack slope. In the unipolar setting, the phase offset waveform out is still oscillating between 0 and 10 volts, but it does not start at 0 necessarily. And in the bipolar setting, the oscillations do start at 0, but do not necessarily reach a certain amount of volts. And this is really dependent on how you set up your offset on Moonwalker. Now, to have a quick look at the reference output. As you can see, the reference output, the green trace on the scope, is also changing shape. It might be somewhat confusing that this output is changing shape as well. I think you can understand or see from the examples in the user guide or manual how this is happening. I think you really better look at the pictures to really make sense of why the waves are shaped like that. But I think it's very apparent that there is a correlation between the two different wave outputs of Moonwalker. And to make a little bit more sense of what you can see on the scope, I think it's important to understand that the green trace is always starting at 0. It doesn't matter where the phase offset knob is, or it doesn't even matter what the shape of the green trace is. It always starts at 0. So if you take that in mind, you can see that the blue trace actually is only this part here. This is one oscillation, so it starts at 0, at least when we're in the bipolar setting, and it goes through its shape until it hits 0 there again at the end. You might think that there's really nothing happening with the blue trace, that everything is just happening for the green trace, but that's not entirely true, and this is really apparent once you start triggering the oscillations manually. Let's switch to unipolar again. Now you can see that at the 180 degrees phase offset setting here, the filter to the right is completely open, and we get kind of a ducking effect. Now, of course, because I have these set up in stereo, this isn't very useful, but I think you can see how you could use this in an interesting way. And then, of course, you can go about doing all these things. Now let's have a listen to Moonwalker at audio rates. I have the reference wave output going through data, and then it's going straight to my mixer. I've switched the speed switch to the right setting, which is the highest setting. I've chosen the bipolar setting, but since we're listening to the reference output at the moment, this does not influence it. But you might be able to see that the LED for the phase offset wave output changes color when we switch it to being bipolar. I've turned on repeat or cycling, looping, whatever you want to call it, and the hard sync or reset or re-trigger button is not engaged. From the moment that you switch Moonwalker to audio rates, the range of the attack and decay knobs becomes a little bit more precise, so there's less reach here. But this makes it easier to get Moonwalker in tune should you want to use it together with other VCOs. And I want to mention something that I didn't show you in the last segment. Whenever the attack and the decay settings are the same or very similar, turning the offset does actually not change the waveform of the reference wave. It's when these are at different settings that you can see these weird shapes happening for the reference wave output. But I think these are very interesting shapes. Of course, you can modulate this setting, which creates this kind of animated wave. And of course, I can still connect a volt per octave sequence. I'm just going to use Moskwa to the left here to the volt per octave input on Moonwalker. And as you can hear, it tracks really well. At some settings, the phase offset modulation might introduce some kind of perceived pitch change. So let's just remove it. For now, we can use the gate trigger or inhibit input as a hard sync when we engage the re-trigger, hard sync or reset button. I'm just going to use, let me remove the volt per octave sequence for a moment. I'm just going to use a square wave coming from even VCO. And as you can see, it's going through data, and I will connect it to this input here at the bottom. And now, because Moonwalker is synced to even VCO, changing the frequency on even VCO changes the frequency that we're getting out of Moonwalker as well. But by changing the frequency settings on Moonwalker, we can change the timbre. We tune even VCO even more down. And you can hear at this setting we're getting these typical sync tones from Moonwalker. We can even use all the modulation at once. Let me add a volt per octave sequence to even VCO. And let's add it to Moonwalker as well. So now I'm sending the volt per octave sequence to both Moonwalker and even VCO. I'm using the square wave output of even VCO through data connected to the trigger, gate or reset input here. The retrigger setting on Moonwalker is engaged, and this gives us these sweet sync tones. Now to add one more layer of modulation, I'm just going to connect a sine wave to the modulation input for the attack. And this creates these interesting changes in timbre. You might notice that changing the direction or reversing the attack and decay stages with the reverse knob doesn't really change the sound all that much, but switching to the alternating mode, you can hear that we're getting an octave down effect. So now let's listen to the phase offset wave output here. Let's add the sync signal from VCO again. You can hear that changing the phase offset manually here does not really change the sound at all. It might introduce some vibrato if you really do it fast. You can add audio rate modulation to this. Let me quickly show you. So now I'm sending a sine wave, the orange cable here, into so this is audio rate phase offset modulation. It's not really the same thing as through zero phase modulation, but I think it sounds really red anyway. Let's quickly listen to this not decay output. Let's remove the sync signal. And you can see that by just using Moonwalker by itself, by listening to the not decay output, which will always send out these pulse waves, by changing the phase offset parameter, you can get PWM style waves. But let's listen to yet another example that is mentioned in the manual. Let's go back to the reference wave output. Let's disengage the hard sync setting. So now this input here at the bottom is, it's again that inhibit input. It's mentioned in the manual to send the same volt per octave sequence to both Moonwalker and the VCO you're sending in. By the way, the yellow trace is still even VCO. Let me turn up the frequency. And you can already see that the blue trace, which is the waveform from the reference output here, becomes this interesting stepped signal. I think it's described in the manual as getting a VCO, the yellow trace, to carve into the shape of Moonwalker. I think this is really cool. And then one extra thing that's mentioned is to use the not decay output on Moonwalker to sync the other VCO too. So I'm going to use this orange cable and I'll connect it to the hard sync input on even VCO. Yeah, I think this sounds really interesting. This really almost sounds like a phase-locked loop. Very interesting. Let's listen to the phase offset output. Now this is completely different. Let's switch this one to the alternating setting. Yeah, very interesting. Let's go back to the reference wave output. Let's quickly modulate the phase offset here. I mean, personally I find this really interesting. Let me quickly add some delay and reverb to this. Now let's have a look at the skew control here. We've been using this input with this attenuverter to modulate the phase offset. But when nothing is connected to this input, this is normalized to the phase offset output, which creates an interesting feedback path that shapes our envelope or LFO in a different way. Let me switch to unipolar mode. We're currently at the slowest setting, by the way, and we're using the phase offset output, which is going through data to modulate a filter. For this, I'm still just using a ripples filter that I'm routing a saw wave from even VCO through. Now let's look and listen to what this knob here does when nothing is connected to its input. And let's just follow what is described in the manual. Let's try to morph or shape this triangle wave into a saw wave. So I've set up the attack and decay times to be as close to equal as I can. Let's turn up the phase offset manually, and then let's see what turning this skew control does to the shape of our LFO. So this feature enables us to morph from a saw wave through a triangle wave to an inverse saw wave. And to demonstrate the second example that's in the manual, which talks about doing this at audio rates. So let's just listen to the output of Moonwalker. It's no longer modulating the filter. I've connected the cable straight to my mixer here. Let's switch to audio rates. I've turned down the phase offset knob manually and now turning up the skew parameter morphs our wave from triangle to saw wave. Please note that if attack and decay are not exactly the same, introducing feedback or skew will change the frequency of your wave. And to make this a little bit more musical, let's send a volt per octave sequence into Moonwalker. Let me change this one up a bit. So now I've connected a volt per octave sequence to the volt per octave input on Moonwalker. And let's try to automate the morphing of Moonwalker between triangle and saw wave. Now, to automate this behavior, we have to be able to manipulate the internal feedback, which is kind of impossible. If you remember that inside Moonwalker, the phase offset output is just normalized or half normalized to the phase offset parameter, we can achieve the same thing by just patching the phase offset output back into this CV input. And we should see exactly the same thing happen. So this connection that I made with the stackable here is essentially just the connection that is half normalized inside Moonwalker. Now, to be able to do something with this, let me patch this melted phase offset output through a VCA. Let me use boundary for this. Now the yellow trace is the signal that's coming out of boundary, which is just the phase offset output that we are attenuating with the built-in envelope. You can see there's some wave shaping or soft clipping, I don't know how to call this, but you can see that the shapes of the waves are a little bit rounded, so it won't be perfect. But let's just try to send this yellow signal back into the phase offset input, mimicking the normalized feedback path that's inside Moonwalker. And when I now turn up this attenuverter, you will see that the blue trace, which is still just the phase offset output here, is in fact shaped from a saw wave to a triangle. Now, instead of routing this melted phase offset output through an envelope VCA combination, I can just as well route it through a VCA that I will modulate with an LFO, which should give us a gradual morph between saw and triangle. Now, to be clear, the yellow trace is the result of sending the phase offset, which is still melted here, through a VCA and modulating that VCA with a bipolar LFO. The VCA I'm using is a 4-quadrant multiplier, so it can go below 0 and invert the signal that we're sending through, which is what you're seeing here. And we're sending this yellow signal back into the phase offset CV input here. And even though we're using a 4-quadrant or bipolar multiplier, you can still see that the output, which we're still listening to, the blue trace here, is indeed morphed between a saw wave and a triangle wave. Let's add some reverb and delay to this. And then once you start adjusting the attack and decay parameters to not be equal anymore, you'll see that using this feedback path will change the frequency. Which is just something to keep in mind. But I think it sounds really interesting nonetheless. The easiest way to get attack and decay times at exactly the same settings is just to turn them completely to the left. But then of course if you want lower notes, it's best to offset your volt per octave sequence with a negative offset. I'm just using mats to do this right now. So what I did is send the volt per octave sequence into the third channel of mats. I opened the attenuator completely for that channel. Then I turned the attenuator for channel 2 down, and I'm using the sum output, which is still the same volt per octave sequence but offsetted negatively with the amount that I set with channel 2 of mats. It's probably a better idea to use a precision adder such as SumDiff here to add stuff together to create a volt per octave sequences. So right now I've changed up my routing. The sequencer output is going into one channel of SumDiff. I have some offset which is negative coming from mats. This is going into the second channel of the lower part of SumDiff, and then I'm using the sum output to send into my volt per octave input on Moonwalker. A last thing that I want to show you in a little bit of detail is creating a feedback path from the phase offset output to either the attack or decay inputs. And when we're monitoring the reference wave output, you can see that adjusting the attenuverter for this feedback creates sloped envelopes instead of the linear ones. Now let's go back to listening to an oscillator going through a filter and modulating that filter with the output of Moonwalker. Let's switch it to the low setting. And let's zoom out here a little bit. Introducing this kind of feedback will change the frequency or the rate of the slopes. You'll see when I now turn this attenuverter for the attack to the left, we get this exponential slope to the attack stage. And when I turn it to the right, let me bring down the rate of the attack manually. You can see that introducing a positive feedback changes this linear curve into more of a logarithmic curve. At least that's what I think these are called. You can do the same thing for the decay parameter. So I'm still sending the phase offset wave output into the CV input that modulates the rate of our decay now. And when I turn this to the left, you can see that not only does our decay time shorten a lot, it makes an exponential curve out of it. And when I turn it to the right, so when I introduce positive feedback, the decay is a lot longer. So let me turn it down manually, and it becomes this logarithmic curve. And of course, if you use another stackable, or you could use a mult as well, you can use this to send the phase offset output to both the attack and decay CV inputs, and then I can create curves that are shaped like this. Let's briefly listen to this at audio rates again. Let me first switch the speed setting to audio rates. Of course, I forgot that we were still running this volt per octave sequence into Moonwalker, which was affecting the timing of our envelopes or LFO a little bit. But the basic idea of curving these shapes was not really influenced by that. So let's again introduce some wave shaping. To our wave. Now I'm changing the negative offset. That's running through some diff to get the frequency up a bit. And when you start using FM feedback, it's always possible that you will affect the pitch tracking as well. And then by just turning the offset here manually, you can change the shape and the sound of the wave drastically. And you can still, of course, modulate this externally. Let's use a stepped random here to modulate this phase offset parameter. By the way, in case you forgot, we're listening to the output of Moonwalker now. It's no longer modulating the filter. Let's send in a pulse wave from even VCO to sync Moonwalker to. For this we need to engage this button. And let me mult this signal here that I'm using as a sequence. Let's mult it and send it into the volt per octave input on even VCO as well. And then if I remove the feedback that was going to the decay parameter and instead route another LFO in there, you can see that this can get really interesting. I think Moonwalker is really surprising. I know it's not really designed to be used mainly as a VCO. It's more of a modulator and a very versatile one. but I actually really enjoy the sound of it. Let's bring in a little bit of delay. This delay is coming from the feedback module's 1-bit multi-tap delay, by the way. And let's bring in a little bit of reverb as well. The reverb is coming from the Happy Nerding Effects 8 XL. And this is going to be it for this video about Moonwalker by Metabolic Devices. The build quality of Moonwalker is really good. It's an aluminum panel. The knobs and the buttons all feel really good. The torque on the knobs is really fluid. There's a little bit of wobble, just like on the make noise knobs, like mats, for example. In general, I'm really impressed with the quality of Moonwalker. There's so much ground to cover with Moonwalker, so if this video sparked your interest and you decided that you want to get Moonwalker, there's still a lot of unexplored territory as to what you can use Moonwalker for. I try to show a little bit more of its features in the sound and patch examples, but with all modulation tools, LFOs, envelopes. The uses for them are really practically endless. Thanks again to Eric for sending me this unit. If you liked the video, please share it with someone who is looking for just a module that's different from everything else. And if you really like my work, you can support me on Patreon or Ko-fi. The links are in the description. Thank you very much to the people who already did so. To everyone out there watching this, thank you very much for watching my video. I hope you learned something. See you next time. Bye.